Why would a woman abandon everything she's ever known to follow a bitter old woman into poverty? What secret did Ruth discover that made her willing to risk her entire future? And how did this shocking decision place her name directly in the royal bloodline of King David and Jesus Christ? Here's what they never told you about Ruth. She wasn't supposed to matter. She was a Moabite, an enemy of Israel. She was a widow with no children, no money, no status. By every rule of her time, she should have disappeared into history without a trace. Instead, she became one of only 5 women mentioned in Jesus's genealogy. But here's the mystery. What really happened in those barley fields? Why did the wealthiest man in Bethlehem risk everything to marry a foreign widow? And what was the secret behind the midnight encounter at the threshing floor that changed both their lives forever? The book of Ruth holds secrets that will shock you. This isn't just a love story. It's a masterpiece of divine strategy hidden in plain sight. Get ready to uncover the truth about the woman who rewrote her own destiny and changed the course of biblical history. The story begins in the days when judges ruled Israel, a time filled with chaos and uncertainty. But nothing could prepare one family for what was coming. As Ruth chapter 1 verse 1 tells us, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. This wasn't just any ordinary dry season. This was a crushing famine that stripped the land bare and brought people to their knees. Picture Bethlehem, whose very name means house of bread, now empty of the very thing it was known for. The rolling hills that should have been golden with grain now stretched out like a brown wasteland. The fields that once waved with barley and wheat now lay cracked and lifeless under the scorching sun. Animals grew thin and desperate, wells ran dry one by one, and families faced an impossible choice: stay and watch your children starve, or leave everything behind and search for life somewhere else. In this desperate time lived a man named Elimelech. His name meant, "My God is King." But right now it probably felt like God had forgotten about being king over anything. Elimelech looked at his wife Naomi, whose name meant pleasant, and their 2 young sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Every day he watched them grow thinner. Every night he heard their stomachs rumble with hunger. Every morning he stared at empty fields and wondered how much longer they could survive. The Bible simply states in verse 1 that this man went to live for a while in the country of Moab. But behind those few words lay the most heart-wrenching decision any father could make. Elimelech was about to do something that went against everything his people believed. He was leaving the promised land. This wasn't just moving to another city or finding a new neighborhood. Moab was enemy territory, a place where people worshipped foreign gods and followed customs that seemed wrong to faithful Israelites. Yet here was a father, watching his family waste away day by day, making the hardest choice any parent could make. He packed up his entire life, gathered his precious family, and walked away from everything they knew and loved. They were trading their heritage for hope, their homeland for a chance at survival. Behind them lay generations of family history. Ahead lay the unknown, guided only by the desperate prayer that somehow, somewhere, they could find life in a land that felt like death to their faith and traditions. The family finally settled in Moab, slowly trying to build a new life in this strange and foreign place. For a while, it actually seemed like Elimelech's incredibly difficult decision had been the right one. They found food on their table again. They had a roof over their heads. The boys started to grow strong and healthy once more. Hope began to creep back into their hearts, and maybe, just maybe, they began to believe that their temporary visit might actually save their family. But then something happened that no one saw coming. Something that would shatter their world completely. As Ruth 1:3 quietly and devastatingly reveals, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Just like that, in a single sentence that hits like a punch to the stomach, everything changed forever. The man who had risked absolutely everything to save his family, was gone, leaving Naomi alone and confused in a foreign land with two young men who suddenly had to become the heads of the household. Imagine Naomi's world crashing down around her like a house of cards. One moment, she was a wife with a husband to protect and provide for her, and the next moment, she was a widow in Moab. She had no husband to lean on, no extended family nearby to help her through this tragedy, and two sons who needed to figure out how to become men very quickly. The very person who had brought them to safety, who had made the brave choice to save them all, was no longer there to guide them through what came next. But life had to go on, even when it felt impossible. Grief doesn't stop the need for food and shelter. The two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, had to grow up fast and learn how to take care of themselves and their mother. And as time passed and they became young men, they did what young men throughout history have always done. They fell in love. Verse 4 tells us something that would have shocked everyone back in Bethlehem. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. These weren't just any ordinary marriages. These were marriages that crossed every cultural, religious, and social line that existed in their world. In a time when people almost never married outside their own tribe, when mixing with foreign nations was seen as dangerous and wrong, these young men chose love over tradition, hearts over heritage. For Naomi, watching her sons fall in love and get married must have brought the most complicated mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt joy watching her boys find happiness and companionship. On the other hand, she felt the bitter realization that her family line was now forever tied to this foreign land and these foreign customs. What had started as a temporary stay to escape famine had become something permanent and irreversible. There was no going back to the way things used to be, no returning to the simple life they had once known in Bethlehem. 10 long years passed, like pages slowly turning in the book of their lives. 10 years of learning new customs and trying to fit into a culture that wasn't their own. 10 years of speaking a new language and building relationships in this Moabite community. 10 years of Naomi watching her daughters-in-law grow from young brides into mature women, and perhaps slowly beginning to feel at home in this place she had once seen as nothing more than temporary exile. Ruth and Orpah brought something precious back into the household, life and laughter, and the sound of women's voices filling rooms that had been too quiet for too long. They learned Naomi's ways and listened to her stories about her homeland. They heard about the God of Israel and the customs of her people. Slowly, carefully, they became not just daughters-in-law, but the daughters Naomi had never had. For a decade, it actually seemed like this little family had found their happy ending after all the early tragedy and heartbreak. Naomi watched Ruth and Orpah become part of her world, and she became part of theirs. They taught each other recipes and shared secrets. They celebrated holidays and mourned losses together. They built the kind of deep, trusting relationship that can only come from years of daily life shared side by side. Maybe Naomi even started to believe that God had brought her to Moab not just to survive the famine, but to gain these two precious women who filled her life with love again. But then, just when life seemed stable and secure, just when they had all learned to be happy again, tragedy struck with a force that left them all reeling. As Ruth 1:5 records with devastating simplicity, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. In one crushing, incomprehensible blow, death visited their house again, and this time it took both of Naomi's beloved sons. Picture this heartbreaking scene. 3 women, all widows now, sitting in a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty and far too quiet. No more male voices calling from the doorway. No more laughter echoing from the fields where the men used to work. No more strong arms to embrace them at the end of a long, hard day. Just silence and the overwhelming weight of loss pressing down on their shoulders like a burden too heavy to carry. Naomi stared at the two young women who had been her comfort and joy for 10 years. They were still young enough to start completely over, still beautiful enough to attract new husbands, still strong enough to build brand new lives from scratch. But what about her? At her age, in this foreign land, with no sons left to care for her in her old age, what possible future could she have? What hope could there be for an old widow with nothing left to offer the world? The three women clung to each other in their grief, but each was also wrestling with her own private fears about what came next. The future had never looked more uncertain or more frightening. Days turned into weeks as the three women tried to figure out what they were supposed to do now. How do you rebuild a life when everything you've built has been torn down? How do you make plans when you have no idea what tomorrow might bring? They moved through their daily routines like people in a dream, going through the motions but feeling lost and directionless. Then news arrived from Bethlehem that changed everything and gave Naomi the first clear sense of purpose she'd felt since her sons died. As verse 6 explains, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return from there. The famine that had driven her family away from their homeland was finally over. The God of Israel had remembered his people and blessed them with harvest once again. For Naomi, this news hit her heart like lightning bolt of possibility. Home was calling to her, but it was calling to a completely different woman from the one who had left all those years ago. She had departed Bethlehem as a wife and mother, full of hope and surrounded by love. Now she would return as a childless widow, carrying nothing but grief and disappointment, but still the call of home was strong. She made her decision quickly and decisively. There was nothing left for her in Moab except painful memories and the constant reminder of everything she had lost. At least in Bethlehem, she could die among her own people, speaking her own language, worshipping her own God. Maybe she could find some distant relative who would help her in her old age, or at least she could find a place where she belonged. But as she looked at Ruth and Orpah, her heart broke all over again in a completely new way. These precious young women had already given up 10 years of their lives caring for her family. They had loved her sons with everything they had, served faithfully in her household, and treated her like their own mother. They had been loyal and kind and everything anyone could ask for in daughters-in-law. Now she was about to abandon them just as surely as fate had abandoned her. The guilt was almost unbearable. But what choice did she have? She couldn't ask them to follow her into a life of poverty and loneliness. She couldn't expect them to sacrifice their futures for an old woman who had nothing left to give them in return. Naomi began to pack her few belongings, her movements slow and deliberate and heavy with sorrow. Every item she folded reminded her of someone she had lost. A piece of cloth her husband had bought, a dish her sons had eaten from, a small treasure that held memories of happier times. But with each piece of clothing, each small keepsake, she was also packing away a decade of love and joy, building walls around her heart to protect herself from any more disappointment. The three women set out together on the long, dusty road that would take them from Moab toward Judah, their few possessions bundled on their backs and their hearts heavy with uncertainty. With every step they took, Naomi's internal struggle grew stronger. She couldn't stop thinking about what she was doing to these two precious women who had already sacrificed so much for her family. The further they walked, the more the guilt ate away at her. These young women had their whole lives ahead of them. They deserved happiness and security and the chance to have children and build families of their own. But if they followed her to Bethlehem, what kind of life could she possibly offer them? They would be foreigners in a strange land, widows with no prospects, stuck caring for a bitter old woman who had already lost everything that mattered to her. Finally, when the weight of her conscience became too much to bear, she couldn't walk another step. As Ruth 1:8-9 records, she stopped right there on the road and turned to face them with tears in her eyes. "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Naomi's voice cracked and trembled as she spoke these words. She was essentially asking them to do something that seemed impossible, to forget the last 10 years of their lives, to pretend their marriages had never happened, to start over as if they had never known love or loss, or the deep bonds that had formed between them. But she also knew this was their only real hope for any kind of meaningful future. "You're still young," she continued, trying to keep her voice steady even as her heart was breaking. "You're still beautiful. You can find new husbands among your own people, have children, build the lives you deserve and dream about. But if you come with me, what do I have to offer you? Nothing but poverty and loneliness and the burden of caring for a bitter old woman who has clearly been forgotten by God." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge that would change everything. Here, at this exact crossroads between Moab and Judah, between past and future, between loyalty and self-preservation, each woman had to choose the path that would define the rest of her life. And whatever they chose in this moment would change their destinies forever. The three women stood there, crying together, holding each other as tightly as if they could somehow stop time itself and avoid having to make this terrible choice. Verse 10 captures the depth of their anguish. "And they wept aloud. Then they said to her, 'We will go back with you to your people.'" But Naomi knew they were speaking from pure emotion, not from wisdom or clear thinking about what was best for their futures. She knew she had to be stronger than her feelings, had to love them enough to let them go. So she pressed harder, painting an even bleaker and more honest picture of what following her would really mean. In verses 11-13, she laid out the harsh reality with brutal honesty. "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Her words hit them like physical blows, each sentence more devastating than the last. She was telling them in the clearest possible terms that following her meant choosing a life of permanent widowhood, with no hope of children or security or any of the things that made life worth living for women in their culture. It was a future too grim and hopeless for anyone to choose willingly. The weeping grew louder and more desperate. These weren't just tears of sadness. These were the tears of women being torn apart by impossible choices, by love and loyalty, competing with wisdom and survival. The sound of their crying echoed across the empty landscape like a lament for everything they were about to lose. Finally, the moment of decision came. As verse 14 tells us with heartbreaking simplicity, "At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her." Orpah made her choice, and it was both heartbreaking and completely understandable. Watch her as she kissed Naomi with all the love and tenderness that 10 years of family life had built. Between them, she whispered her goodbyes through tears that seemed like they would never stop flowing. Then, with shoulders shaking from sobs, but steps that were determined and resolute, she turned back toward Moab, toward everything familiar and safe and sensible. Orpah was choosing survival over sentiment, security over sacrifice, practical wisdom over romantic loyalty. She was making the choice that almost anyone in her situation would make, the choice that made sense, the choice that offered hope for a real future. And honestly, who could blame her for that? Who could criticize her for choosing life over a beautiful but ultimately pointless gesture? But Ruth didn't move. even as Orpah's figure grew smaller and smaller in the distance, even as the practical choice walked away down the dusty road, Ruth held tighter to Naomi's arm and refused to let go. Her grip was firm and determined, as if she was holding on to something much more important than just an old woman's hand. Naomi looked at her with surprise and fresh pain. She had expected both women to make the same sensible choice. Now she had to try one more time to convince Ruth to save herself. "Look," she said, pointing toward Orpah's retreating figure with desperation in her voice, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. It's not too late. You can still catch up with her and return to everything you've ever known." This was Ruth's final chance, her last opportunity to choose the easy path that made sense to everyone else. One word, one step, and she could catch up with Orpah and return to familiar customs, comfortable traditions, and the real possibility of finding love and security again. The sensible choice was right there within reach, calling to her to be practical and think about her own future. Instead, she did something that nobody expected, something that seemed to defy all logic and reason. Something that would echo through history and be remembered thousands of years later. Ruth opened her mouth and spoke words that would become some of the most beautiful and powerful in all of human literature. Ruth 1:16-17 gives us her immortal response, words that have inspired countless people through the centuries. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." These weren't just pretty words spoken in an emotional moment, the kind of dramatic promise that sounds good but fades when reality sets in. Ruth was making a binding oath, calling on God himself to witness her commitment and hold her accountable to it. She was choosing to abandon literally everything: her homeland, her culture, her religion, her language, her family, and her future. Security, to follow an old woman into complete uncertainty. Think carefully about what she was giving up. The chance to remarry among her own people who understood her background, the comfort of familiar customs and traditions that had shaped her entire life, the security of her family's support and protection, and what was she choosing instead? Poverty, isolation, the burden of caring for someone else's grief, and life as a permanent foreigner in a land that might never accept her. But somehow, Ruth saw something that others missed. In Naomi's bitterness, she saw a loyalty worth following. In Naomi's pain, she saw a love worth sharing. And in following Naomi's God, she saw a truth worth any sacrifice, no matter how costly it might be. When Naomi finally realized that Ruth was absolutely and completely determined to come with her, that no amount of arguing or reasoning would change her mind, verse 18 says simply, she stopped urging her. What was the point of continuing to fight? Ruth had made her choice with her eyes wide open, fully understanding what she was giving up and what she was choosing instead. So the two women continued their long journey together, but now everything about their situation had changed completely. They walked mostly in silence, each woman lost deep in her own thoughts and fears about what lay ahead. Naomi wrestled with overwhelming guilt about allowing Ruth to make such an enormous sacrifice. What kind of person lets someone throw away their entire future out of misguided loyalty? Ruth probably spent those quiet miles wondering what kind of life awaited her in a land where she would be forever marked as an outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone whose very presence reminded people of Israel's enemies. Would anyone accept her? Would she ever feel at home? Had she just made the biggest mistake of her life? The miles passed slowly and painfully under the hot sun until finally, after what felt like forever, They crested a hill and saw it spread out below them. Bethlehem, Naomi's hometown, the place she had left so full of hope all those years ago. Naomi's heart should have leapt with joy at seeing her birthplace again, at recognizing familiar streets and houses and landmarks from her childhood. Instead, she felt nothing but a deep, aching emptiness. She had left this place full, with a husband who loved her, 2 sons who needed her, and boundless hope for the future they would build together. Now she was returning with nothing but a foreign daughter-in-law and a heart so full of pain that it felt like it might burst from the weight of it all. As they entered the town, walking slowly down streets that held 1,000 memories, Ruth 1:19 tells us, "So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, 'Can this be Naomi?' The townspeople barely recognized her. 10 years of exile and immeasurable sorrow had changed her so much that she looked like a completely different person. But Naomi's response in verses 20 to 21 revealed just how deep her transformation and pain really ran. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them with a voice full of bitterness. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." She wanted her very name changed, from pleasant to bitter. This wasn't just grief talking or temporary sadness that would fade with time. This was a woman making a public declaration that her old self, the happy woman they remembered, had died in Moab along with her husband and sons. The woman standing before them now was someone entirely different, someone permanently marked and changed by loss. And so, as verse 22 brings this first chapter to its conclusion, Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. 2 women, both carrying invisible wounds that would take time to heal, stepped together into an uncertain future just as the fields around them were bursting back to life with the promise of new grain and fresh hope. The morning sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Ruth made a decision that would change everything. She and Naomi had been back in Bethlehem for only a short time, but already the reality of their situation was becoming crystal clear. They had no money, no food, and no way to support themselves. 2 widows with empty stomachs and an empty house. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. Ruth looked at Naomi, who seemed lost in her own world of bitterness and grief. The older woman barely spoke anymore, barely moved from her corner except when absolutely necessary. If anything was going to happen to save them from starvation, Ruth knew it would have to come from her own hands and her own courage. As Ruth chapter 2 verse 2 records, "And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor.'" These simple words represented something much bigger than they seemed. Ruth was volunteering to do something that would have been difficult for any woman, but for her it was especially risky and potentially dangerous. Think about what she was really suggesting. Gleaning was the practice of following behind the harvesters and picking up whatever grain they dropped or left behind. It was back-breaking work under the hot sun, and it was typically done by the poorest of the poor, people who had absolutely no other options. But more than that, Ruth was a foreigner, a Moabite woman, in a land where Moabites were considered enemies. She would be working in fields full of strange men who might not be kind to an outsider. She might face rejection, insults, or even physical harm. Some landowners might chase her away without letting her gather even a handful of grain. Others might allow their workers to treat her badly just because of where she came from. But Ruth had made up her mind. As the verse continues, Naomi simply replied, "Go ahead, my daughter." There was no excitement in Naomi's voice, no encouragement or blessing, just a tired acceptance of what seemed like their only choice. Ruth was going to risk her safety and dignity to put food on their table, and there was nothing else to say about it. So Ruth prepared herself for a day that would test every ounce of courage she possessed. She would walk into those fields as a complete stranger, hoping to find someone willing to show kindness to a Moabite widow. She had no idea that this brave decision was about to set in motion events that would change not just her own life, but the entire course of biblical history. Ruth stepped out into the morning light, her heart pounding with nervousness and determination. Bethlehem's fields stretched out before her in every direction, some already busy with workers swinging their sickles through the grain, others still quiet in the early morning calm. She had to make a choice. But which field should she try first? Ruth 2:3 tells us, "So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters." As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. The Bible uses that fascinating phrase, "as it turned out," as if Ruth just happened to wander into this particular field by pure chance. But was it really chance? Ruth didn't know the area, didn't know which fields belonged to which owners, and had no way of knowing that she was walking onto property owned by someone connected to her dead father-in-law. She simply picked a field that looked promising and hoped for the best. Picture Ruth walking along the edges of different properties, trying to work up the courage to actually step into one of them and start picking up grain. She probably felt like everyone was watching her, wondering who this foreign woman was and what she thought she was doing in their neighborhood. Finally, she chose one field that seemed busy with workers and walked right in. She didn't know she had just stepped onto land belonging to Boaz, a wealthy and respected man in Bethlehem. She didn't know that Boaz was actually related to Elimelech, Naomi's dead husband. She had no idea that this random choice was about to bring her face to face with someone who could change her entire future. Ruth simply bent down and started picking up grain that the harvesters had dropped or missed. Handful by handful, she began filling her container, working under the hot sun with the kind of determination that comes from knowing your life depends on it. She was focused completely on the task at hand, unaware that divine providence was orchestrating every step she took. What seemed like coincidence was actually God's invisible hand guiding her feet to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. But Ruth didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that she had found a field where the workers weren't chasing her away, and she was going to work as hard as she could for as long as they would let her. The sun was climbing higher when a new voice cut through the sounds of harvest work. Someone important had arrived in the field, and Ruth could sense the change in atmosphere immediately. Workers straightened up and spoke more respectfully. There was a different energy in the air. Ruth 2:4 introduces us to this moment. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. This wasn't just casual small talk. These were the words of a man who honored God and workers who respected their boss. But Ruth had no idea who this person was or why everyone seemed to treat him with such reverence. Boaz looked around his field, checking on the work and the workers as any good landowner would do. But then his eyes stopped on someone he didn't recognize, a young woman working among the gleaners, someone who clearly wasn't from around here. As verse 5 records, Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" In that culture, women were typically identified by their relationship to men, whose daughter they were or whose wife. But this woman was working alone, with no male protection or identification. The overseer had obviously been watching Ruth and was ready with information. Verse 6-7 gives us his response. She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Listen to what the overseer had noticed. Ruth wasn't lazy or taking advantage of the situation. She had asked permission politely, instead of just assuming she could work there. She had been laboring steadily since morning with only a brief break. She showed respect, determination, and a strong work ethic that impressed even the field supervisor. But more than that, the overseer specifically mentioned that she was the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. Word had already spread through Bethlehem about Naomi's return and the foreign daughter-in-law who had chosen to come with her. Ruth's reputation for loyalty and kindness had preceded her into this field. Boaz was getting his first real look at the character of this young woman, and everything he heard impressed him. Here was someone who had given up her own country to care for a grieving mother-in-law, and who was now working hard under difficult circumstances to provide for both of them. This wasn't just any gleaner, this was someone special. What happened next was completely unexpected. Instead of simply nodding and moving on to other business, Boaz did something that would have shocked everyone in that field. He walked directly over to Ruth and spoke to her personally. Ruth 2:8-9 captures this remarkable moment. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." Think about how extraordinary this was. Boaz, a wealthy and powerful landowner, was personally speaking to a poor Moabite gleaner. He was calling her "my daughter," a term of endearment and protection. He was giving her exclusive permission to work in his field and nowhere else, essentially guaranteeing her a stable source of food. But even more amazing was the protection he offered. He had specifically instructed his male workers not to touch her or bother her in any way. In a world where women, especially foreign women, were often vulnerable to harassment or abuse, this was incredibly significant. Ruth could work safely knowing that the owner himself was watching out for her, and the offer of water was huge too. In the heat of harvest season, water was precious. Typically, gleaners would have to find their own water sources or hope someone would take pity on them. But Boaz was telling Ruth to drink freely from the same water that his own workers used. She was being treated like family instead of like an outsider. Ruth's response shows how overwhelmed she was by this kindness. Verse 10 tells us, "At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, 'Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?' More, she literally threw herself to the ground in gratitude and amazement. She couldn't understand why this powerful man was being so kind to someone like her. In her mind, she was nobody special, just a foreign widow trying to survive. She had expected at best to be tolerated, and at worst to be chased away. Instead, she was being treated with honor and generosity that seemed too good to be true. Boaz looked down at Ruth, still bowed on the ground before him, and his next words revealed that he knew much more about her story than she had realized. This wasn't just random kindness from a generous landowner. This was recognition and respect for someone whose character had impressed an entire community. Ruth 2:11-12 gives us Boaz's powerful response. Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." These words hit Ruth like a thunderbolt. Boaz wasn't just being nice. He understood the enormous sacrifice she had made. He knew she had left everything familiar and safe to care for Naomi. He recognized that her decision to come to Israel meant she had chosen to trust in Israel's God instead of the gods of her own people. The phrase, "under whose wings you have come to take refuge," was especially meaningful. It was the language of covenant protection, the way someone would describe a person who had truly converted to faith in the true God. Boaz was acknowledging that Ruth's journey to Bethlehem wasn't just geographical, it was spiritual. Ruth had grown up worshipping Moabite gods, but somewhere along the way, she had learned about the God of Israel from Naomi. She had seen something in Naomi's faith that was worth following, even when that faith seemed tested by tragedy and loss. Now Boaz was blessing her in the name of that same God, welcoming her into the community of believers. Ruth 2:13 shows how deeply these words affected her. "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." She was overwhelmed by being treated with such dignity and respect. Notice how she described herself. She didn't even consider herself worthy to be counted among his regular servants. She was a foreign gleaner, someone on the very bottom of the social ladder. Yet Boaz was treating her like someone precious and valuable, someone whose faithfulness deserved recognition and reward. For the first time since arriving in Bethlehem, Ruth felt truly welcomed and accepted. This wasn't just about food anymore. This was about belonging, about being seen and valued for who she really was. When lunchtime came, something happened that Ruth had never dared to dream about. Instead of sitting alone on the edges of the field with whatever meager food she might have brought, she found herself receiving an invitation that changed everything. Ruth 2:14 records this amazing moment. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come, over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." This wasn't just politeness. Boaz was inviting Ruth to share a meal with him personally. A wealthy landowner was asking a poor Moabite gleaner to eat at his table. The verse continues. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. Picture this scene. Ruth, who had probably gone to bed hungry many nights recently, now sitting with the workers and eating until she was completely satisfied. She even had leftovers, something she could take home to Naomi, but the generosity didn't stop there. When Ruth got up to continue gleaning after lunch, Boaz did something that was absolutely unprecedented. Verses 15-16 tell us, as she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." This was extraordinary beyond words. Normally, gleaners were only allowed to pick up grain that had accidentally fallen to the ground. They were forbidden from taking anything directly from the harvested bundles. But Boaz was telling his workers to actually take grain out of the bundles and drop it on purpose for Ruth to find. He was essentially giving her a private harvest within the public harvest. His workers were to treat her not like a gleaner at all, but like someone deserving special care and provision. This level of favor was unheard of in that society. Ruth worked through the afternoon, hardly believing what was happening to her. Everywhere she looked, there seemed to be extra grain just waiting to be picked up. The workers were kind to her. No one bothered her, and the amount of grain she was collecting was far beyond anything she had hoped for. When the day finally ended and Ruth gathered up everything she had collected, the result was astounding. Verse 17 tells us, "So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah." An ephah was roughly 20 to 30 pounds of grain, an enormous amount for a single day's gleaning. Most gleaners would be thrilled to collect a few pounds of grain in a day. Ruth had gathered enough to feed herself and Naomi for weeks. This wasn't just provision, it was abundance, beyond anything she could have imagined when she first stepped into that field that morning. Ruth hurried home as fast as she could, her heart racing with excitement and her arms aching from carrying so much grain. She couldn't wait to show Naomi what had happened, to share the incredible story of kindness and provision that had filled her entire day. When she arrived at their small house, Ruth 2:18 tells us she carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Picture Naomi's shock when she saw the enormous pile of grain Ruth was carrying, plus the leftover food from lunch. Naomi stared at the abundance spread out before her, hardly believing what she was seeing. This was far more than any gleaner should have been able to collect in a single day. Something extraordinary had happened, and she needed to know what it was. As verse 19 records, her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had worked. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. The moment Ruth spoke that name, everything changed. Naomi's eyes went wide, and for the first time since they had arrived in Bethlehem, something like hope flickered across her face. Boaz wasn't just any landowner, he was family. Ruth 2:20 captures Naomi's amazing reaction. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." This was the first time since arriving in Bethlehem that Naomi had spoken a blessing instead of bitterness. The woman who had asked to be called Mara because of how bitter her life had become was suddenly talking about God's kindness again. The abundance Ruth had brought home was opening Naomi's eyes to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, God hadn't abandoned them after all. The term kinsman redeemer was crucial. In their culture, a kinsman redeemer was a male relative who had the responsibility and right to help restore a family's fortunes. He could buy back property that had been sold due to poverty, he could marry a widow to continue the family line, and he could provide protection and support for relatives in need. Naomi realized that this wasn't just a lucky encounter with a generous stranger. This was a divine appointment with someone who could actually change their circumstances permanently. God had guided Ruth's steps to exactly the right field, to exactly the right person, at exactly the right time. Ruth listened to Naomi's explanation about kinsman redeemers with growing wonder, but she also knew that one day of favor didn't guarantee anything permanent. She would need to prove herself consistently and build trust over time if anything significant was going to develop from this amazing beginning. Ruth 2:21 tells us more about what Boaz had told her. Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Boaz hadn't just been kind for one day. He had essentially offered Ruth a job that would last through both the barley and wheat harvests. This was incredible security for someone in Ruth's position. Instead of having to search for new fields every day, wondering if she would be welcome or safe, she now had a guaranteed place to work with guaranteed protection. She could focus on doing her best work instead of worrying about where her next meal would come from. Naomi's response in verse 22 shows how wise she was about the situation. "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." Naomi understood the dangers Ruth had been facing and how precious this protection really was. So Ruth settled into a daily rhythm that would define the next several weeks of her life. Every morning, she would join Boaz's female workers and head out to the fields. Every day, she would work steadily and faithfully, gleaning grain while staying close to the other women for safety and companionship. Day after day, She proved herself to be reliable, hard-working, and respectful. She didn't take advantage of Boaz's kindness or become lazy because she knew she was protected. Instead, she worked even harder, grateful for the opportunity and determined to deserve the trust that had been placed in her. The other workers began to accept her as one of their own. Word of her character and faithfulness spread throughout the community. She was no longer just the Moabite woman. She was becoming Ruth, Naomi's daughter-in-law, the one who works in Boaz's field. Ruth 2:23 concludes this chapter with a simple statement that represents so much more than it appears to say. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. This wasn't just about the work, it was about belonging, building relationships, and proving day after day that she was someone who could be trusted and valued. Through weeks of faithful work, Ruth was establishing herself as a permanent part of the community while providing steady support for herself and Naomi. She had no idea that someone was watching her faithfulness very carefully, and that all of this consistent character building was preparing her for a conversation that would change everything. The harvest season was finally over, and with it came a time of quiet that gave Naomi space to think. For weeks, she had watched Ruth go out to the fields every day and come home with grain and stories about Boaz's continued kindness. She had seen how her daughter-in-law's reputation in the community had grown, how people spoke of her with respect and admiration. But now the harvest was finished, and Ruth would no longer have a reason to be in Boaz's fields every day. The daily contact that had been building something special between them was about to end. If anything was going to happen, it had to happen now, before the opportunity slipped away forever. Naomi looked at Ruth and realized that for the first time in years, she actually had something resembling hope. This young woman had given up everything for her, had worked tirelessly to provide for them both, and had won the favor of the most respected man in Bethlehem. Maybe it was time to stop accepting whatever scraps life offered and start fighting for something better. As Ruth chapter 3 verse 1 tells us, one day Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for." The word Naomi used for home carried deep meaning. It meant security, protection, a place where Ruth would truly belong and be cared for permanently. This wasn't just about finding Ruth a husband. This was about securing her future, giving her the kind of life she deserved after all her loyalty and sacrifice. Naomi had been thinking strategically about how to make this happen, and she had come up with a plan that was both bold and risky. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours, Naomi continued in verse 2. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. This wasn't casual conversation. Naomi was setting the stage for something significant. She knew that Boaz would be working late into the night, separating the grain from the chaff, and she knew this created a unique opportunity. Naomi was about to suggest something that would require tremendous courage from Ruth. She was going to ask her daughter-in-law to put everything on the line in one bold move that could either secure their future or destroy Ruth's reputation forever. But she had watched Boaz's behavior carefully, had seen the way he looked at Ruth and treated her with special kindness. She believed the risk was worth taking. The older woman took a deep breath and prepared to share a plan that would test Ruth's trust in her completely. Naomi's plan was unlike anything Ruth had ever heard before, and it required the kind of courage that could only come from complete trust. The instructions were specific and detailed, and they would put Ruth in an incredibly vulnerable position. Ruth 3:3-4 records Naomi's careful guidance. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." This wasn't just advice. This was a cultural ritual that carried deep significance. By washing and anointing herself with perfume, Ruth would be preparing herself like a bride. By waiting until Boaz had finished his meal and was settling down, for the night she would be approaching him at his most relaxed and content moment. And by uncovering his feet and lying down, she would be making a request that went far beyond words. In their culture, this action was a way of asking a man to spread his garment over her, a symbolic request for marriage and protection. It was the woman's way of saying, "Will you be my covering? Will you take responsibility for me?" But it was also incredibly risky, because if the man rejected her, she would be left in a position of complete humiliation. Ruth listened to these instructions with a heart that was probably pounding with fear and uncertainty. Everything about this plan went against her natural shyness and modesty. She would have to sneak onto the threshing floor in the dark, approach a sleeping man, and make herself completely vulnerable to whatever his response might be. But Ruth had learned to trust Naomi's wisdom, and she had seen Boaz's character over many weeks of working in his fields. If Naomi believed this was the right thing to do, Ruth was willing to risk everything on that belief. Ruth 3:5 gives us her simple but powerful response: "I will do whatever you say." No arguments, no questions, no demands for more explanation. Ruth was going to place her future entirely in God's hands and trust that somehow this bold plan would lead to something good. As darkness fell over Bethlehem, Ruth began preparing herself for the most important night of her life. She washed carefully, applied precious perfume that she had probably been saving for a special occasion, and put on her best clothing. With every step of preparation, she was moving closer to a moment that would change everything forever. The threshing floor was quiet now, except for the gentle sound of the night breeze rustling through the piles of grain. Boaz had finished his work for the day and had enjoyed his evening meal. The air was cool and pleasant, and he had settled down to sleep right there on the threshing floor, as was common during harvest time to protect the valuable grain from theft. Ruth moved through the darkness like a shadow, her heart beating so loudly she was sure it would wake him. She had watched from a distance until she was certain Boaz was asleep, and now she approached the place where he lay. Everything about this moment felt surreal and terrifying, but she had come too far to turn back now. Following Naomi's instructions exactly, Ruth quietly uncovered Boaz's feet and then lay down at the foot of his sleeping area. Now, all she could do was wait and pray that when he woke up, he would understand what she was asking and respond with kindness rather than anger or rejection. The hours passed slowly. Ruth lay there in the darkness, barely daring to breathe, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Then sometime around midnight, something woke Boaz. Maybe it was the cool air on his uncovered feet, or maybe it was just the sense that someone was nearby. Ruth 3:8 captures this pivotal moment. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Imagine Boaz's surprise and confusion. He had gone to sleep alone, and now he was waking up to find a woman at his feet. In the darkness, he couldn't immediately tell who it was. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice probably a mixture of surprise and concern. Ruth's answer in verse 9 was both humble and bold. "I am your servant, Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." With those words, Ruth made her request clear. She was asking Boaz to marry her and take on the responsibility of caring for her and Naomi. She was putting her entire future in his hands and trusting him to respond with honor and kindness. Boaz's response in verses 10 to 11 reveals the kind of man he truly was. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." Boaz was not angry or offended by Ruth's boldness. Instead, he was impressed by her loyalty and wisdom. He recognized that she could have pursued any number of younger men, but she had chosen to honor her family obligations and approach the one who had the legal right to redeem them. Just when it seemed like everything was going to work out perfectly, Boaz revealed a complication that neither Ruth nor Naomi had anticipated. There was a legal issue that had to be resolved before he could do what Ruth was asking. Ruth 3:12-13 records Boaz's careful explanation. "Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." This was devastating news. Ruth had summoned all her courage to approach Boaz, had risked her reputation and her future, only to learn that someone else had the first legal right to marry her and redeem her family's property. All of her hope now depended on what this other relative would decide to do. But notice Boaz's character in this moment. A lesser man might have taken advantage of the situation, might have been willing to bypass the legal requirements for his own benefit. But Boaz was committed to doing things properly, according to the law, even if it meant he might lose Ruth forever. He was also practical about the immediate situation. Ruth couldn't leave the threshing floor in the middle of the night without creating a scandal that would destroy her reputation. She would have to wait until morning, spending the night in this incredibly awkward situation, trusting that Boaz would protect her honor. The promise Boaz made was solemn and binding. "As surely as the Lord lives, I will do it." He was calling on God as his witness that if the closer relative refused his responsibility, Boaz would step in and fulfill the role of redeemer. Ruth could trust that promise completely, but she also had to face the possibility that the closer relative would accept the responsibility, which would mean marrying him instead of Boaz. She would have to trust that God's plan was bigger than her own preferences and that whatever happened would be for the best. Ruth lay there in the darkness beside this honorable man who had just promised to take care of her future one way or another. She didn't know what the morning would bring, but she knew she was in the hands of someone who would treat her with respect and integrity, no matter what happened. The night passed slowly, with both of them probably lying awake, thinking about the conversation that would take place at the city gate the next day, a conversation that would determine the rest of Ruth's life. As the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, Boaz knew that Ruth needed to leave the threshing floor before anyone else saw her there. Her reputation depended on this midnight encounter remaining private until he could resolve the legal situation properly. But Boaz also knew that Ruth would be returning to Naomi with questions about what had happened, and he wanted to send a message that would give both women hope while they waited for his next move. He needed to send a sign that would tell them he was serious about his promise and committed to taking care of them. Ruth 3:15 tells us what happened next. He also said, "Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. This wasn't just a generous gift, it was a symbolic message that spoke louder than words. 6 measures of barley was a substantial amount of grain, enough to feed Ruth and Naomi for quite some time. But more than the practical value, This gift was Boaz's way of saying that Ruth would not go home empty-handed, that he was already providing for her even before the legal matters were settled. The symbolism was powerful too. Just as he was filling her cloak with grain, he was promising to fill her life with provision and security. He was demonstrating that he was a man who backed up his words with actions, who would take care of her needs even when he wasn't legally obligated to do so yet. Then he went back to town, the verse concludes. Boaz left Ruth there in the early morning light, carrying this heavy bundle of grain and an even heavier burden of hope and anticipation. He had work to do in town, legal arrangements to make, conversations to have, a future to secure. Ruth made her way home through the quiet streets of Bethlehem, probably struggling under the weight of all that barley, but feeling stronger and more hopeful than she had in a long time. The night had been terrifying and uncertain, but it had ended with a promise and a gift that proved Boaz's intentions were honorable. When she arrived home, Naomi was waiting anxiously for news. Ruth 3:16 captures this moment. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" You can hear the tension and hope in that simple question. Ruth told her everything that had happened and then showed her the grain that Boaz had given her. Verse 17 records her words. He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, "Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed." Naomi understood immediately what this gift meant. This wasn't just grain, this was a promise. A down payment on a commitment that Boaz intended to fulfill. Her plan had worked, and now all they could do was wait to see how the legal situation would resolve itself. Boaz wasted no time in addressing the legal complication that stood between him and Ruth. Early that morning, he made his way to the city gate, which served as the courthouse and business center of Bethlehem. This was where all official transactions took place, where contracts were made, and where disputes were settled in front of witnesses. Ruth 4:1 shows us how deliberately Boaz handled this situation. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there. Just then, the family redeemer he had mentioned came along, so Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. This wasn't a coincidence. Boaz had positioned himself at the gate specifically to intercept this relative when he came into town. He was taking control of the situation and making sure it was resolved quickly and properly. Next, Boaz gathered the required witnesses for this legal transaction. Verse 2 tells us, Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. 10 elders was the standard number needed to make official legal decisions in their culture. Everything Boaz was doing showed that he understood the law and was committed to following it exactly. Now came the crucial conversation. Boaz presented the situation carefully, starting with the part that would be most appealing to the closer, relative. Ruth 4:3-4 records his words. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." This was smart strategy on Boaz's part. He started by talking about the land, which represented a good business opportunity. Land was valuable, and redeeming it would add to the relatives' wealth and holdings. At this point, it seemed like a straightforward and profitable transaction. The relative's response in verse 4 was immediate and positive. "I will redeem it." He was thinking only about the financial benefit of acquiring more property. He had no idea what else was involved in this particular redemption. But Boaz wasn't finished. He had presented only half of the legal obligation, and now came the part that would change everything. The relative was about to learn that redeeming the land came with responsibilities he hadn't considered. Boaz had carefully set up this moment, and now it was time to reveal the complete picture of what redemption would require. The closer relative had agreed enthusiastically to redeem the land, but he didn't yet understand the full scope of his responsibility. Ruth 4:5 captures the pivotal moment when everything changed. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land, from Naomi you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." The silence that followed these words must have been deafening. Suddenly, this wasn't just about buying land. It was about taking on a wife and the responsibility to have children who would carry on the dead husband's name rather than his own. Any sons born to Ruth would inherit the redeemed property, not the Redeemer's existing children. You can almost see the relative's face changing as he realized what this would mean for his own family's inheritance. If he married Ruth and she had sons, those children would have a claim on his wealth. Instead of adding to his own family's holdings, he would be creating potential competitors for his existing heirs. His response in verse 6 was immediate and decisive. At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself." "I cannot do it." The land deal that had seemed so attractive moments before was suddenly too risky and complicated for him to handle. Now came the formal legal procedure to transfer the right of redemption from one man to the other. Verse 7 explains, "The custom, now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel." Verse 8 tells us what happened next. "So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, 'Buy it yourself,' and he removed his sandal." This simple action was legally binding and irreversible. By removing his sandal and giving it to Boaz, the closer relative was officially transferring all rights and responsibilities to him. It might seem like a strange custom to us, but in their culture, the sandal represented a person's right to walk on and possess land. By giving his sandal to Boaz, the relative was symbolically saying, "You now have the right to walk where I could have walked. This responsibility is yours, not mine." Boaz held that sandal in his hands and knew that everything had just changed. The legal obstacle that had stood between him and Ruth was now gone. He was free to marry her, to redeem Naomi's property, and to restore their family line. What had seemed like a complication was actually becoming the path to everything he had hoped for. With the sandal exchange complete and the legal formalities finished, Boaz turned to the assembled elders and made a public declaration that would change 4 lives forever. This wasn't just a private conversation anymore. This was an official legal proceeding with binding consequences. Ruth 4:9-10 records Boaz's powerful announcement. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." These words sealed Ruth's future and restored her place in the community. She was no longer just a foreign widow struggling to survive. She was about to become the wife of one of Bethlehem's most respected men. The property that Naomi had lost would be redeemed and restored to their family line. The response from the witnesses was immediate and enthusiastic. Verses 11-12 capture their blessing. Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. This blessing was remarkable because it placed Ruth among the great matriarchs of Israel. Rachel and Leah were the wives of Jacob, who became the mothers of the 12 tribes. Tamar was another foreign woman who had married into the line of Judah. The elders were prophesying that Ruth's children would be significant in Israel's history. So Boaz married Ruth, and their happiness was complete when verse 13 tells us, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son." The women of Bethlehem celebrated with Naomi as if the child were her own grandson. Ruth 4:14 and 15 records their joyful words. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Naomi took the child and became his nurse, as verse 16 tells us. The bitter woman who had returned from Moab empty-handed was now filled with joy again, holding her grandson and surrounded by celebrating friends. The child was named Obed, and Ruth 4:17 gives us the genealogical significance. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Ruth's son would become the grandfather of Israel's greatest king. The book concludes with verses 18 to 22, tracing the family line from Perez through to David, showing how Ruth's faithfulness and love placed her directly in the royal lineage that would eventually lead to the Messiah. The Moabite widow, who had risked everything for love and loyalty, became one of the most honored women in biblical history. If this story has touched your heart, if you've discovered something new about this incredible woman of faith, I want to ask you to do 2 things. First, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who are passionate about discovering the hidden treasures in God's Word. Every week, we're diving deep into biblical stories that will change the way you see Scripture forever. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear Ruth's story today. Maybe it's a friend going through a difficult season, someone making a tough decision, or anyone who needs to be reminded that God is writing their story even when they can't see the bigger picture. Your share could be exactly what someone needs to hear today. The book of Ruth reminds us that no choice made in faith is ever wasted, no act of love ever goes unnoticed, and no story is too small for God to use in extraordinary ways. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and I'll see you in the next video.